This is a 1989 Autech Zagato Stelvio AZ1, and it's weird. You probably already realized that. In fact, you're probably thinking, what is Autech? What is a Zagato Stelvio? What is this thing? And why does it look like this? Good questions all. Today I am going to review this car and I'll explain everything. Before I get started, a quick note about Cars and Bids, my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era. We recently sold an Autech Zagato Stelvio AZ1 on Cars and Bids, and it was purchased by the same person who owns this one. So yes, that means he has two. Now, he shipped the one he bought on Cars and Bids to a different residence, so I am reviewing this one. But this is exactly the kind of weird, quirky, and cool car that Cars and Bids is becoming known for. So if you're looking to sell your special, interesting modern car, check out Cars and Bids. You will get the most interest and the most bids and money for your cool car. And if you're looking to buy a cool car from the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids has daily auctions and amazing selection at carsandbids.com. So let's talk Autech Zagato Stelvio AZ1. This car is owned by Myron Vernus, who's become sort of famous on Instagram and elsewhere for his interesting collection of weird and special and quirky cars. You can follow him on Instagram with the link in the description below. And if you're into weird cars, you have to know about this one because frankly, this is peak weird. Now, the AZ1 was based on the Nissan Leopard, which was a coupe that was sold here in North America as an Infiniti, but the engine was tuned by Nissan tuner Autech, and the interior and exterior were created by famous Italian design house Zagato, and they made it weird. Very weird. And it was expensive. These were only sold in Japan. Back in 1989, this car cost $180,000 in 1989 money, which is equivalent to like $300,000 today. An unbelievable amount of money to spend. And at that price point, it's no surprise that they only made about 100 of these for the entire world. They're incredibly rare, but thankfully I have tracked down this one, thanks to Myron, and today I'm going to review it. First, I'll take you on a tour of this car and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Autech Zagato Stelvio AZ1. And I'm gonna start out here with actually the keychain. Look at this, Autech on one side, Zagato on the other side. This is unbelievable. They made fewer than 100 of these cars, and it's not like Autech and Zagato got together for any other cars. There was only one more, and it was even rarer than this one. But there is a purpose-made keychain for this vehicle. I cannot believe I am seeing this. That might be the rarest thing of all here. And by the way, I want to talk production numbers for a second. If you Google this car online, you will find sources that say they built 104 and other sources that say they built 88. The actual total isn't known. The original plan was to make 200 of these cars, but they didn't get that far. These all have a plaque inside that gives which number each one is, and nobody has seen a plaque higher than 87. So they're thinking around that is the total production for these cars. This one has plaque number 81. As you can see in the interior. But we are getting ahead of ourselves here, because if you want to talk quirks and features of this car, you gotta start with the exterior design, which is truly bizarre. Absolutely weird and crazy and strange and insane. Now, like I said, the exterior was designed by Zagato, which is sort of a famous Italian design house. And frankly, they're kind of famous for making some strange, interesting, sort of weird, quirky designs. And this car certainly qualifies. In this time period, they were also making Zagato Aston Martin models, which, as you can see, also have kind of a strange look to them, not the traditional beautiful, clean, flowy Aston Martin design. And they made the Alfa Romeo RZ and SZ, which were also famous for simply being weird. So this car was frankly right up the Zagato alley, and boy is it strange. Now, this car has a bunch of weird design traits and quirks, and I'm going to cover cover all of them, but by far the most obvious is the mirrors. They are not in the normal place, sort of at the base of the front window. Instead, they are here on the hood, under these little cubbies. Looks almost like eyelids or ears sticking out from the hood. You have the mirrors. Absolutely bizarre. Now, throughout the 1960s, 70s, 80s, Japanese cars did have their mirrors mounted on the front fenders, on the sides. By the time this car came out, that was largely done, but I think that the intent here was to kind of pay tribute to the old school Japanese cars that used to have their mirrors mounted in this spot, and it's supposed to be like a modern take on the old Japanese mirror mounting location. Instead, it comes off as absolutely strange. One of the most bizarre design details in any car ever. I truly mean that. Now, interestingly, in these little cubbies, you had sort of a normal looking mirror, just like a regular rectangle, but the cubbies weren't rectangular. And so around the mirror, you have these weird like vent looking things that look almost like strakes that are just there to kind of fill the rest of the space, because otherwise it would look even weirder, as if that's somehow possible. But like I said, the mirrors are far from the only weird design trait on this car. Zagato of this era was known for weird, and they certainly delivered with this vehicle. Another strange one is the wheels, which you can see they have no spokes. They're just sort of a solid silver piece. No traditional spokes like every other wheel, but there is a duct in these wheels, like a NACA duct, which looks like it's intended to bring air into the wheels and into the brakes. I asked the owner about this duct, and he sort of jokingly said he thinks they installed it just to spark arguments among engineers. Some of the engineers he's spoken to have said, yeah, it brings air into the brakes, it's brilliant. Others have said, no, it has no purpose at all, it's ridiculous. Whether or not it actually is functional, I guess we'll never know. But that is the only interruption in the otherwise solid wheel. Very strange. And the weird design choices continue around the back, where you have this little line here that comes sort of from the top in back, and then down a little bit on the side, and then goes down the side of the car. Now, that's not that unusual of a line for cars that have wraparound taillights in back, but this one doesn't have wraparound taillights. It just has this sort of random line that comes down, and then it creates extra space back here that they have to fill with another fake vent, because otherwise it would just look even weirder than it already does. Again, a very odd design choice on the outside. But anyway, next up, another weird quirk outside. Even though this line sort of simulates where the taillights could be, where they actually are is down here in this horizontal light bar that goes across the entire rear end of the car. And if you look inside this light bar, you can see on each side a brake light, a turn signal, and a reverse light, all the exact same size, 3 on each side, which of course makes sense. Interestingly, the light bar is tinted, which of course diminishes the effectiveness of the brake light, the reverse light, and the turn signal, but it's intended to make the rear end, I guess, look a little bit better and a little bit smoother, I guess. And in fact, they've done a few things to try to make the rear end look smoother without interruptions like most normal cars have. For instance, there's no keyhole back here. You can't actually access the trunk from the rear of the car. There's no way to get in back here because they didn't want to have an ugly keyhole just sticking out. You also don't have badging back here. There's no Autech Zagato badge in the back. There's no badge at all, except it says Stelvio back here, which is the model name. That is the only rear badge on this car. You got up behind one of these in traffic, you would be quite confused. I promise you that. And by the way, another interesting exterior item worth noting is the color. It looks like dark blue at first glance, but it's actually one of those color shifting colors that looks different depending on what light you're in. It can look blue or purple or even green. Difficult to see today because we don't have direct sunlight, but if I shine my phone flashlight, you can see the green flakes, and it really does look green in bright light. It's sort of like Ford's Chroma Flare paint that they put on those Mustang Cobras for a little while. Not quite as intense as that, which you can see shifting color a little bit more, but it is still a pretty cool color. Only 2 of these were made in this color, and this is one of the 2. And next up, we move up front with the Autech Zagato Stelvio. A couple of interesting things up here. For one, the headlights. These headlights are shared with the Nissan Silvia from this era, the S13 Silvia, which is a car that has a pretty big following of its own. I bet most Silvia owners don't realize that their headlights are also in this bizarre thing. Now, another interesting thing up here is the front badge, which you can see says Autech Zagato, and they've even created a little logo for this partnership with an A, and then of course the Zagato Zagato Z right in the center and very visible. Now obviously Zagato, like I said, created the body, designed the car. Autech was a tuning arm within Nissan that was intended to bring Nissan models even more power and performance, and so that's where Autech comes from. Pair it with Zagato and you have the AZ1, this car. And next we move under the hood in this car, which isn't actually that easy of a task. You pop the hood in the normal way, little latch in the driver's footwell, but then opening it is actually kind of a challenge because it is tremendously heavy, because it includes the side mirrors and all this extra bodywork. So lifting up the hood is actually probably one of the heaviest hoods I have ever lifted up. But once it's up, then you can see the powertrain. Now this is a turbocharged 6-cylinder with about 320 horsepower, which was a pretty healthy figure for the time, especially in Japan in the late 80s. Not too many powerful cars, but you had this one. Now you can see on the engine it says Nissan off to the side, but it also says tuned by Autech on the top. Just to remind you, this isn't one of your usual Nissan engines. It's been tuned by Autech, which, like I said, was a tuning arm of Nissan designed to extract a little more power and performance from its engines. By the way, one other interesting hood detail, you can see with the hood up, there are like little covers, plastic covers over where the headlights would be. Now this is especially unusual because the headlights themselves have covers on them already. Like I said, they're just the headlights from the S13 Silvia. So they have a cover, and then the hood has another cover that goes over the top of them. I guess this was to make the headlights work better with this design, or at least so thought Zagato. But anyway, next we climb inside the Zagato Stelvio. But as you might imagine, just getting in this car is kind of quirky with the door handle on the outside, which operates like the door handle in a Mercedes 300 SL Gullwing. You push this little silver button, it pops out the door handle, then you pull it and open up the door. Kind of an aspirational door handle in this car. Now, when you climb in this interior, you're probably pretty impressed if you've spent time in other late 1980s Japanese cars, which were more about practicality than beauty. Zagato did the interior of this car as well as the exterior, and everything in here is classier than it would be if it had been just a regular Nissan model. Everything's a little bit nicer, a little bit more luxurious to go along with the Zagato name and the Zagato price tag. Now, one thing you'll notice is I am sitting over here on the right side of the car. Like I mentioned earlier, these were all sold in Japan, Japanese market only, and so all of the Autech Zagato Stelvios are right-hand drive cars since the Japanese market drives on the right side. And to be honest, these are mostly all still in Japan with a few limited exceptions. Like I said, Cars and Bids sold one of these to the current owner of this car, but he shipped it to a property that he owns in another country, so that one is no longer in the United States. In fact, he thinks that this might be the only one here in the United States. So you're not going to see a lot of Autech Zagato Stelvio AZ1s driving around. Even if you're in Japan, of course, incredibly rare, but that was the market they were destined for. But anyway, back to the interior in this car, and like I said, classier than a normal Japanese car interior from this time. Everything in here is leather. The dashboard, the door panels, the seats, everything, or at least Alcantara, and you can see on the door panel that the door pull is finished in this Alcantara. It's wearing a little bit, but they wanted you to pull the door closed, not by touching metal or cheap plastic, but instead this lovely soft Alcantara surface. They've even put this fuzzy little pad on the interior door latch. Now to me, this looks like some cheap thing you'd buy to stick on the bottom of furniture so it doesn't scratch your floor, but here it is in order to make opening the door a slightly more classy experience than just touching ugly cheap plastic. Now, worth noting, also on the door panel, you have your power mirror controls here, and yes, they do work. You can control those crazy power mirrors on the hood by using the power mirror control here in the door panel, just as if they were normal mirrors, which they are not. You also have a speaker on the door panel, and you can see it says Zagato on the speaker rather than like a stereo company. Zagato really wanted to get their name in this car and make sure you knew that it was special. Same deal on the steering wheel. You can see right in the center it says Zagato Design, not Autech, Nissan, Stelvio, Zagato, because that was the most special part about this car. Now, I must say, as classy as Zagato tried to make this interior, it is kind of an interesting mix of regular Nissan stuff and Zagato classiness. For instance, you have sort of regular Nissan switchgear in the center control stack for the climate controls and some other buttons in here. You also have a relatively standard Nissan gear lever in here, automatic transmission lever, that was in a lot of Nissan models in the late 80s and early 90s. Doesn't really look all that different from other Nissans. And by the way, all of these were automatic transmission. I think they thought that it classed up the car. It was a Zagato Italian influence, classy luxury vehicle, and so it should have an automatic, and so they all do. But anyway, despite the Nissan switchgear in here, you do have some beautiful Zagato upgrades to improve things. Like I said, leather everywhere, but it goes further than that. You have a little panel over on the dashboard on the passenger side with wood that says Stelvio on it, reminding you how special your car is. You also have gauges that are distinctive from regular Nissan gauges. These are Zagato designed, and they certainly look different and more exciting. And the reason Zagato was able to make all these changes is because they built this car. Nissan would send them chassis and powertrains from the Leopard, the Nissan Leopard, which this car was based on, and then Zagato would put on the body and do the interior in Italy, and then send everything back to Japan, where the cars were actually sold. So this car, not only designed by Zagato inside and out, but mostly assembled by them too. But anyway, some other interesting quirks in this interior. For one thing, the wiper stalk is kind of unusual. In order to adjust the speed of the wipers, you twist the end of the wiper stalk, and then this little blue line sort of retracts or extends based on how much you're twisting, and that increases or decreases the speed of the wipers. Very odd way to do that, but that's how it was done in Nissan models from this era. Also unusual in this car is the power locks. This car has power locks. They're operated with a little button in the center, except it doesn't say lock and unlock. It says on and off. You want to unlock the car, you press off. Then they're not locked anymore. You've turned the locks off, or you can also turn the locks on if you want to as well. Kind of odd. Two other interesting controls in here in the center control stack. For one, you have a little button marked Sports with an image of a steering wheel on it. You press that and it's supposed to tighten up the steering, and I can confirm it actually does work. Drove the car a little bit earlier. You press that and it really does feel a little bit tighter and more responsive. So it's kind of an early adjustable steering setting in this car. You also have the fuel door button there, kind of a strange location for it, right in the front and center of the interior, but you press that and then the fuel door pops open on the outside of the car. Kind of strange placement. And next up, we move on to the back of the Autech Zagato Stelvio. This car does have back seats, although they're pretty small, as you might imagine. Getting into them is a little bit difficult. First, you have to move the front seat all the way forward, which can only be done with the electronic seat adjustment, so you're waiting a little bit of a ways. But once you've got it all the way forward, you can then pull on this little pull cord back here, and the seat back goes forward, and then you can climb in back, which of course I will do. Although it is quite challenging to get back here. Now, once you're in back, you quickly discover there isn't really anything interesting or quirky back here, except the speakers in back say Bose on them. Remember, the speakers up front said Zagato, but I guess they felt it wasn't as important to inform your rear passengers that you're in a Zagato. They could make do with just knowing the name of the speaker company. And next up, we move on to the trunk in the Stelvio, the cargo area. Now, like I mentioned, there's no like keyhole back here to get into the trunk. You don't even have like a little popper trunk release thing. Instead, the only way to get into the trunk in this car is a little switch in the driver's area up front. You flip the switch and it pops the trunk open, and then it puts it in this position and you can open it up, which is a little inconvenient if you want to walk up to the car and put some luggage in it. You have to walk into the interior, undo it with the switch, and then you can come back here. When you get back here, you'll find the trunk is really not all that big. Surprisingly small, actually, for sort of a Grand Touring type car with 4 seats, and the spare tire takes up a pretty good amount of what little room there is. Surprisingly small trunk in here. But I will note you do have a beautiful toolkit in this trunk. It's leather bound, and there's even like saddle leather in the middle with some beautiful snaps, and it says Autech Zagato on it. There are not too many Autech Zagato toolkits that you will find, but this car has one. And in fact, this car even has its original owner's manual, which is also Autech Zagato specific to this car. Very cool. And surprisingly, about half of this owner's manual is in English. Japanese, of course, for half, English for the other half, which really is kind of a shock since this car was never intended really to be sold outside of Japan. But very interesting to see this owner's manual, and there are even some drawings showing this car. You can see right here, here is the Zagato Stelvio pictured in its owner's manual. Not too many of these manuals, not too many of these drawings, but pretty pretty cool to see. And so those are the quirks and features of the Autech Zagato Stelvio AZ1. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, time to drive the Autech Zagato Stelvio AZ1. I have to tell you, I've spent a little time driving this car around, and the first thing that I've realized, the first big surprise, it's actually pretty good to drive, which I wasn't really expecting given how it looks. But before I get to the drive, I want to put this car in a little context when it came out and why it was built in the first place. So back in the late 80s, Japan was experiencing a crazy economic boom that turned out to be a bubble. And this is a period is now actually referred to as the bubble economy in Japan. But everything was expensive, and they were coming out with all sorts of crazy stuff, including a Nissan paired with Zagato that cost the equivalent of $300,000. It made sense at the time given the context of the economy. And frankly, it might sound familiar today. But anyway, it's also not too crazy to imagine spending that kind of money for a purpose-built, special, limited production Zagato car. Zagato recently did a run of limited edition Aston Martins that cost $1 million, or at least that was their sticker price. They didn't really sell for that. But the point is, a limited production car from Zagato, they tend to bring big money. And so, it made some sense at the time to sell this for big money. But anyway, I want to talk driving experience because I am perplexed by the fact that this car actually drives well, which I wasn't really expecting. Okay, first off, acceleration. 320 horsepower is nothing to scoff at, and so I should have expected that it would be quick. But I don't know, you look at this car and you're just so enamored by how bizarre it is. You don't think that it could possibly be like a good performance car, but you floor it and it moves. I mean, this is a fast car. It feels fast even by modern standards, and I wonder what it would have felt like if it had had the stick shift instead of this automatic, which is kind of a shame. It sort of dulls the performance in this car. But it's not just that I like about the car. It actually handles pretty well too, which is a bit of a surprise. The odometer is currently showing 48,000, I'm sure that's kilometers, 25,000 miles. The car hasn't had much time to wear, and indeed, it feels not very worn. Suspension seems like pretty tight and pretty well put together. It seems surprisingly nice to steer, to turn, to drive. You get good steering feedback, less vague than a lot of the other Japanese sports cars I've driven from this era. It actually drives reasonably well. And frankly, another benefit of this car is it's pretty comfortable and pretty easy to drive. Unlike a lot of very limited production, Italian design special cars, it's practical. I mean, I can sit in here normally. Obviously, it's not some low-slung exotic supercar. It's reasonably acceptable to sit in. Now, the reason for that is it doesn't look as good. Let's just put it out there. It doesn't look as good as a lot of low-slung, low-production number Italian supercars. This car looks weird. It looks strange. And that's both a selling point and a drawback. I think that alone is the main reason that these have stayed relatively cheap, but it also sort of fits with Zagato's theme from the time. They were building Aston Martins that looked really weird. They were building a few, the Alfa Romeo SZ and RZ, very weird looking cars. Now, I want to interrupt for a second to talk about the mirrors, which are obviously one of the most unique design elements of the car. They actually work pretty well, especially the one over on the driver's side fender. I can see out of it. I can see exactly what I want to. It's a little trippy at first not to look in the normal place for a mirror, but when you see where it is, it works okay. The other one is a little bit of an issue though. From my seating position, a portion of it is cut off by the dashboard. It's a little far away. That mirror to me, not quite as ideal, but they work, it still works, and both of them work better than you'd think. Overall, my feeling of this car, it doesn't drive all that badly. So the 300ZX had the twin turbo version of this motor. This is the single turbo version. It doesn't drive like a 300ZX. It's not quite as sporty. It doesn't quite handle as well. It's not quite as fast, but it's not far behind. And given the price point of this car, I think it's a total bargain to get a ultra rare Zagato designed and built car with decent power and performance for $25,000, $30,000, $40,000. To me, that's a steal. But it's also weird and not the most attractive car, and it's based on a Nissan instead of some cool Italian car, so maybe these never go up really all that much in value. But I don't know, I think it's a pretty cool vehicle, and I've always wanted to check it out, at least since I've known about it over the last few years, and I'm thrilled I had the chance. And so that's the Autech Zagato Stelvio AZ1. What a bizarre vehicle. And frankly, I can't imagine ever paying $300,000, the equivalent, for this. But I'm equally surprised that the one we had on Cars and Bids sold for only $25,000. Ultimately, it's an extremely limited production car done by Zagato, who's made some iconic designs. These are a bargain, frankly, if you can find one, and that's not easy. Anyway, now it's time to give the Stelvio Zagato AZ1 a DOUGSCORE. And the DOUGSCORE is here, 46 out of 100, which places it here against some other cars I've reviewed from this era that are sort of similar, I guess. Truthfully, though, the Autech Stelvio Zagato is kind of on its own. It's rarer than anything else on this list, and it's weirder than anything else on this list. But it drives pretty well, and it's quite special when you consider the history and the Zagato influence. I liked this car more than I expected, and I'm thrilled I had the chance to check it out, considering just how absolutely bizarre it is. I always love the weird stuff.